Nogo-Jingawang, now known as Peterborough County, were the traditional hunting and fishing grounds of the Mississauga First Nation. They established villages in this area before any European settlement. The First Nations of this area surrendered the land to the British government in exchange for a specific amount of money and goods that was to be paid on an annual basis. These agreements were made through treaties, like Treaty Number 20, or Rice Lake Purchase. That is why we begin our journey at Nobbin Camp, which represents a Mississauga Anishinaabe hunting or ricing camp from the mid-1820s. This site brings to light the First Nations history of this area, like how despite the promise of early treaties and the respectful partnerships they established, Indigenous peoples were targeted by colonial policies designed to exploit, assimilate, and eradicate them, and how the local Mississauga First Nations played a very critical role in the survival of many settlers, especially in their first winter here in Canada. We now move on to our Fife cabin, which represents a typical home for settlers. This cabin was built in 1825 and is the oldest building we will see today. The life of a settler was not a luxurious one, and settlers were not prepared for what Canada held for them, as illustrations showed unrealistic images. Cabins would be built in haste, with materials acquired on the land. The logs themselves would remain round due to time restraints, and cracks would be filled with such things as moss, grass, or small pieces of wood. The chimney is built with a stone base, but wood pieces would line the top, adding an additional hazard to the already difficult life. As you enter the cabin, you get a glimpse of the small and sparse dark quarters. The logs on the inside are just as they are on the outside, exposed and unfinished. In this cabin, the family was lucky enough to have glass windows. However, glass was not always available to the early settlers, and in a lot of cases, it was not affordable either. Those families sometimes used oiled paper to cover the window openings. There is a fireplace in the cabin, known as a hearth, but it provided little heat. With a wooden chimney, settlers had to pay mind to the fire, as having it too large could result in the chimney catching ablaze. As well, with no insulation and gaps between the logs, it would be a struggle to keep the cabin warm. An early settler in this area, Catherine Partrail, commented in a letter home that it was so cold the water in a bucket had turned to ice. The hearth may provide a small amount of light, but tallow candles would be used to illuminate the cabin. These candles would be made by the family using animal fat. These candles would be made in advance to last the winter, and would be used sparingly, as each candle only lasts 5 hours. That is why, when able, during the day, they would be outdoors using natural light. Evenings in the cabin would be lonely. Settlers did not have the comforts to enjoy, so they would rejoice in the little luxuries they had. Like a Bible, time would be spent either reading passages or letters from home. But as nightfall set, the family would prepare for bed. This family, the Fifes, included David, Jane, and their 3 children. They would share this bed known as a settle bed, which would be folded up into a bench during the day and pulled out at night. As day came, the family would be busy. Luckily, they were able to depend on the knowledge of the Mississauga, and they would have adopted their footwear, moccasins, as the leather boots they came with were not adequate. They also adopted snowshoes to distribute their weight to travel over snow in the Canadian winters. Looking around the cabin, the influence of the Mississauga is present, like the jacklight, which would have been used for fishing. Settlers learned that the jacklight could be attached to the front of a canoe, where the light of the burning would attract fish to where they could be speared. Hung from the ceiling are food sacks. Settlers would hang their food to keep them off the ground to help eliminate bugs and mice from getting into them. As we view this cabin, we see that life at this time was hard, and much of the day was spent clearing the land and managing survival. Though, as we move to the Fitzpatrick house, we see what those hard years developed into. This house is restored to the 1840s and is a typical second home. This house, unlike the first cabin, has an upstairs, which had bedrooms for the 8 children and Grandma. The first room we enter into is the girls' room and also a utility space for spinning or other household activities. The rooms off of it are the boys' room and Grandma's. During the winters, however, the door would be shut to the upstairs, as it would be very cold with no source of heat to the upstairs. They would, however, all sleep downstairs by the hearth. Just like the Fife cabin, this house also had a hearth, which would be the main source of heat and used for cooking. The chimney, being purely stone, meant that the larger fires could be made to maintain the heat in the downstairs of the house. Food and herbs from the garden would be hung to dry by the hearth for preservation. The hearth had many various pots and cooking utensils, which would aid in making meals easier. A small food pantry replaced the sacks hung in the Fife cabin. The shelves would provide space to keep dried food or ingredients, as all cooking would be done inside. As you walk through the house, you will see the development from the first cabin. The rooms have proper furnishings, the walls are plastered, and in the parlor, painted. Wall hangings show needlepoint and embroidery that young girls would have now time to do. A sampler is an example of the difference of life for children from the Fife cabin to the Fitzpatrick, as now time allows for needlepoint. Proper windows meant the house would be brighter throughout the day, making indoor activities an option, though, as nightfall set, tallow candles would still be lit to illuminate the house until bedtime. Our next stop is our Milburn house, a house restored to the 1870s and 30 years newer than the Fitzpatrick house. We walk past a white picket fence, manicured gardens to the interior of the house. The first room indicates the comforts of this home, a parlor, like the Fitzpatrick, but more furnished, with wallpaper and a box stove to warm this side of the house and the children's bedroom. Off the parlor is a small room, which may be Grandma's room or sick room. Moving upstairs are the comfortable bedrooms for this family of 8. We enter into the parents' bedroom first, which features a closet and beautiful big bed. Across the hall is the children's room, which would have been shared. You can see there are toys and luxuries that the first 2 houses did not have. Downstairs in the kitchen is a large cast iron stove. This stove is known as a step stove and is where all the cooking was done. The pipes of this stove go through the floor, heating the parents' bedroom. Behind the stove sits an ice box, which works like a modern refrigerator. Ice would be collected in the winter and then placed in this box to keep the contents cool. A small room sits off the kitchen, which is called a pantry, and where the family could store their food. This would be ingredients, canned goods from the garden, or goods bought from the store. The comforts of this home continue, with the indoor cistern pump and coal oil lanterns replace the candles from earlier times. a more reliable and brighter option. Now, the object is making life easier, rather than how to survive. As we walk through the village, we are met with various businesses along our path, like our print shop, where newspapers will be published, our Keene Hotel, which is a stagecoach stop, the mini general store where all you need could be bought, and finally, our blacksmith shop. Our last stop is our South Lake Schoolhouse, which is restored to the 1870s. As we enter the school, you are met with one room. Grades 1 to 8 were all in this one room with one teacher. The rules would be quite strict, with boys and girls expected to line up outside until instructed. The boys and girls would then be separated on either side of the classroom. On the side board, rules for students were listed and expected to be followed. It was not necessary for children to attend school until 1871, so some students would be simply taught from home the necessary domestic and farming skills. Classroom supplies were limited, and students would each have a slate or chalkboard to take note. Around the classroom, you can see such things like the Union Jack flag, cursive writing on the board, and a communal water bucket for drinking. Now that you have seen what life was like for the Mississauga, the settlers, and school children 200 years ago, do you think you'd like to step back in time and walk in their footsteps?